Hey, my name is Caleb Hartley. I'm 34 years old, and I keep bees on a hillside orchard in the north of Georgia, in a town so small most maps just show it as a bend in the road. I live alone in a farmhouse my grandfather built, at the end of a gravel lane lined with apple trees older than I am. In spring, the hives sit in the shade of those trees, and if you stand still in the middle of the orchard on a warm morning, the whole place hums like a single low note you can feel in your chest. People in town call me the honey man. Some of them think I'm strange for spending my days with a wooden box full of insects and a smoker that smells like burning pine. Maybe I am. But bees don't lie to you. They don't leave. They just work, and if you treat them right, they give you something sweet at the end of it. I wasn't always this quiet. There was a time, a long time ago, when I would have told you I hated this orchard and everything in it. To understand why I stayed, and why one Saturday morning changed the whole shape of my life, I have to take you back 15 years, to the summer I was 19 and had already decided I was worthless. That summer, my parents were gone. My mother had passed when I was 17, cancer, quick and cruel, and my father followed a year later in a way I still don't like to name. He simply stopped wanting to be here. One cold morning he wasn't. After that, it was just me and my grandfather, Silas Hartley, on this same hillside, with a bank letter on the kitchen table that said we were 3 months behind on everything. I was angry back then. Angry at the town, at the bees, at the apple trees, at a God I wasn't sure I believed in. My grandfather would go out at dawn to check the hives, and I'd stay in bed with the blanket over my head, listening to him talk to the bees the way other men talk to old friends. "You have to tell them things," he said to me once. "When someone in the family dies, you go out and you tell the bees. If you don't, they leave. That's the old way." I told him the old way was nonsense. He just smiled and went back outside. That was the summer she came the first time. Except I didn't know it was her. I didn't even know her name. I've spent 15 years trying to remember her face, and for 15 years all I had was a red bicycle, a skinned knee, and a jar of honey. Let me tell you how it happened, because that jar is the reason for everything that came after. It was the middle of July, hot enough that the tar on the road went soft. My grandfather had set up a little stand at the bottom of our lane, just a wooden crate and a hand-painted sign that said Hartley Honey, and he'd send me down to sit with it in the afternoons. I hated that too. I'd sit in the dust feeling sorry for myself while cars blew past without slowing. That afternoon a girl came down the road on a red bicycle, going too fast on the loose gravel where our lane met the county road. I saw it happen in slow motion, the front wheel sliding out, the bike going one way and her going the other. She hit the ground hard and skidded, and the bike clattered into the ditch. For a second I just sat there. Then something in me, some part that wasn't dead yet, got up and ran over. She was maybe 14, thin, with dark hair coming loose from a braid, and a scrape down her whole left shin that was already welling up with blood and grit. She wasn't crying. She was staring at her knee with her jaw clenched like she was furious at it for bleeding. "Don't move," I said. "You'll grind the dirt in." I helped her over to the shade of the honey stand and made her sit on the crate. I ran up to the house, got water and a clean rag and the little tin of first aid things my grandmother had left behind, and I came back and cleaned the wound while she gripped the edge of the crate and breathed through her teeth. "You're not from around here," I said, just to give her something to think about besides the sting. "My aunt lives out on Belmont Road," she said. "I'm staying with her for the summer. My parents they're figuring some things out." I knew that voice, the one people use when their family is coming apart and they're trying to sound like it isn't. I'd used it myself. "Yeah," I said. "I know how that goes." She looked up at me then, really looked, like she was deciding whether to believe me. She had this way of looking at a person that felt older than 14. Then she nodded, once, like I'd passed some test. When I'd wrapped her leg, I didn't know what else to do, so I did the only thing I had. I reached into the crate, took out a small jar of honey, and put it in her hands. "Here," I said. "It's from our bees. It's good for cuts, actually. And it's good for feeling terrible, which you look like you do." She turned the jar over. The afternoon light came through it, gold and slow. And for the first time since she'd hit the ground, she smiled. "How much is it?" "Nothing," I said. "You already paid. You made my whole boring day interesting." She laughed at that. A real laugh, surprised out of her. We talked for maybe an hour, sitting in the shade while her leg dried. She told me she liked to draw, that she carried a notebook everywhere, that she wanted to see the ocean someday because she'd never seen it. I told her about the bees, mostly to have something to say, and to my surprise she wanted to know everything. How the hive decided things, how the queen was made, why my grandfather talked to them. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she said, when I told her about telling the bees your sorrows so they wouldn't leave. "I'd never leave a place like this." "You would if you lived here," I said. "No." She looked around at the orchard, at the hives in the green shade, at the light coming down through the apple leaves. "No, I don't think I would." Her aunt's car came down the road looking for her before the sun got low. The girl stood up, tested her leg, and picked up her bent bicycle. At the edge of the road she turned around and held up the jar of honey like she was making a toast. "I'm going to come back someday," she said. "When things are figured out, I promise. I'll come back and buy honey from you, and I'll pay for it this time." "Sure," I said, the way you say it, when you don't believe a word of it. But she wasn't joking. She looked me dead in the eye, 14 years old with a bandaged leg and a jar of honey, and she said it again, slower. "I promise, Caleb, 15 years or 50, I'll come back." I never told her my name. She must have seen it on the sign. Hartley. But she said Caleb, so my grandfather must have called it out at some point. Or I said it and forgot. It doesn't matter. What matters is she said my name like it was a thing she intended to keep. Then she rode away up the county road, wobbling on the bent wheel, and I never saw her again. I know how that sounds. A boy meets a girl for one afternoon at 14 and 19, and then she's gone, and that's it, that's the whole story. People have summers like that and forget them by autumn. But I didn't forget, that's the strange part. In the weeks after, when things got worse, when my grandfather's heart started failing, and the bank letters got angrier, I'd think about her. Not in a longing way. It was more like she'd left a small light on somewhere in me. The idea that a stranger could sit in the dirt with you and tell you your bees were the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard, and mean it, that idea kept me company. I decided that summer not to leave. I decided to learn the bees properly, the way my grandfather knew them. Part of it was for him, but part of it, if I'm honest, was because a girl on a red bicycle had told me she'd never leave a place like this, and I felt ashamed of wanting to. My grandfather died 2 years later, in his sleep, in the spring, with the orchard just starting to bloom. The morning I found him, I did something I'd sworn I never would. I walked out to the hives in the gray light, and I put my hand on the nearest box, and I told the bees that Silas Hartley was gone. My voice shook. I felt like a fool, but I told them, because he'd asked me to, and because I couldn't stand the thought of them leaving too. They stayed. 15 years later, they're still here. So am I. The orchard became mine. I built the honey business up slow, jar by jar, market by market, until Hartley Honey was in 3 shops and a farmer's market 2 towns over, and I could pay the bank and keep the lights on and even put a little away. I got good at it. I got known for it. What I didn't get was unlonely. The town watched me turn 30, then 32, then 34, still alone in that farmhouse. Well-meaning women brought me casseroles. Their daughters came to the market and lingered at my stand. I was polite. I sold them honey. But something in me was waiting, and I couldn't have told you for what. I told myself I was just a private man who liked his bees. That's the story I believed about myself, right up until the Saturday morning she walked back into it. It was late September. The apples were in, the air had that first clean edge of autumn, and I was at the farmer's market 2 towns over, at my usual spot under the oak tree, with rows of jars catching the morning sun. amber, dark buckwheat, pale spring clover, the comb honey I only made a little of. Business was slow and easy. I was half daydreaming. Then a woman stopped at my table. She was about my age, maybe a year or two younger. Dark hair, loose, with a few strands going where they wanted. A canvas bag over one shoulder with the corner of a sketchbook poking out of it. She had a stillness to her, like someone who had learned to hold themselves quiet. She looked at my jars for a long moment, not the way customers usually look, deciding which one to buy, but the way you look at something you've been trying to find. "Hi," I said. "Everything here's ours. From my hives up in Copper Hollow. If you want, I can tell you which one's which." She looked up at me, and something happened in her face. Some feeling moving under the surface that I couldn't read, that made my own chest go tight for no reason I understood. "Do I know you?" I asked. It came out before I could stop it. It sounded strange, too direct. But I couldn't shake the feeling. She didn't answer right away. She picked up a small jar, the same size jar my grandfather used to keep at the stand at the bottom of the lane, and she turned it over in her hand so the light came through it, gold and slow, and I felt 14 years fold in on themselves like they were nothing. "You keep bees," she said. "It wasn't a question. All my life. Up on a hillside with apple trees." I stopped. "How do you know that?" She set the jar down, very gently, and looked at me with that same look she'd given me once before, older than her years, deciding whether to say the thing. "I promised I'd come back," she said. 15 years ago, I told a boy on a hillside I'd come back and buy his honey, and pay for it this time." Her voice caught. "I'm sorry it took me so long. I couldn't speak." The market noise fell away. The whole Saturday morning narrowing down to a woman with a sketchbook and a jar of my honey. "You," I said. "The red bicycle." She laughed, and there were tears in it. "You remember the bicycle. You skinned your whole leg. You wouldn't cry. You cleaned it with honey and your grandmother's first aid tin. You gave me a jar and wouldn't let me pay." She pressed her lips together. "I've carried that jar around for 15 years, Caleb. Empty. I never opened it. It's on the windowsill of every place I've ever lived. I gripped the edge of the table the way she'd once gripped the edge of the crate." "I don't even know your name," I said. "I never knew it." "Nora," she said. "Nora Bennett. I was 14. I was staying with my aunt on Belmont Road the summer my parents split up." She swallowed. "That was the worst summer of my life, and that afternoon on your hill was the only good thing in it. You have no idea what you did for me." I have thought since about how close I came to never knowing. If I'd stayed home that Saturday, if she'd walked past my table, if either of us had lost our nerve. But she didn't walk past. She stood there with the morning behind her and waited, like she'd been waiting the whole way here. "I close up at noon," I heard myself say. "There's a place across the square that does coffee, if you'd let me buy you some." 15 years is a long time to catch up on. Nora smiled, and it was the same smile from the honey stand, the one that came up slow and surprised, like she hadn't expected to be happy. "I'd like that," she said, "but I'm buying the honey first." I promised. She paid for the little jar. I tried to wave it off out of pure habit, and she put the money on the table and held my eyes until I took it. Then she put the jar in her canvas bag next to the sketchbook, and she waited under the oak tree while I sold the last of the morning's amber. And I felt her there the whole time like a warmth on my side. We had coffee that stretched into lunch. Lunch stretched into a walk around the square, and then to the little river that ran behind the market, where we sat on a stone wall and she showed me her sketchbook. It was full of orchards, hillsides, rows of apple trees, beehives drawn over and over from memory, some of them not quite right in the details in a way that told me she'd been drawing them for years without seeing one. "I became an illustrator," she said. "Children's books, mostly. I draw places for a living." She turned a page. "I think I've been drawing your hill this whole time and not letting myself admit it." She turned back a few pages, hesitated, then let me see. On the inside cover of the sketchbook, in the careful hand of a much younger person, someone had written a single line in faded pencil, and traced over it again in ink years later so it wouldn't fade. The honey hill. Go back. I've copied that line into the front of every sketchbook I've filled since I was 15, she said. 40-something of them. It was the first thing I wrote when I got a new one. Go back, go back, go back. She gave a small, broken laugh. You'd think after writing it 400 times a person would actually do it. I looked at that line, traced and retraced over 15 years, and I had to look at the river for a minute so I wouldn't come apart in front of a woman I'd technically just met. Why did it take you 15 years? I asked. I didn't mean it as an accusation. I wanted to understand. She was quiet for a while, watching the water. Because I was ashamed, she said finally. That summer my family fell apart, and I got shipped around for a lot of years after. Aunts, a boarding school, my mother when she was well enough, my father when he remembered he had a daughter. I told myself when things were figured out, I'd go back to the honey hill. But things were never figured out. There was always a reason it wasn't the right year. She looked at me, and the longer I waited, the bigger that promise got. It stopped being a small thing a kid said. It became the one good clean thing I still had. I was scared to spend it. What if I came back and the hill was gone? What if you were gone? What if you didn't remember, and I found out the best afternoon of my life had only ever happened to me? I remembered, said. I never stopped remembering. I stayed on that hill partly because of you. I couldn't tell you why for 15 years. She looked at me, with her eyes bright. So what finally brought you? I asked. My aunt died in the spring, she said. The one on Belmont Road. I came back for the funeral, and afterward I couldn't make myself leave the county. I kept driving out to look at hillsides. And then I heard two women at a shop talking about the honey man from Copper Hollow. And one of them said his family had kept bees on that hill for 3 generations. And I had to sit down in the aisle because I knew. I just knew. I found out which market you went to. And then I stood in my aunt's kitchen every Saturday, for a month working up the nerve, and I lost it every time. She shook her head. This was the 5th Saturday I told myself I'd go. It was the first one I actually did. 5 Saturdays, I said. I'm a coward about the things that matter, she said, but I got here. You did. We sat with that for a while, the river going by, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. Will you show me the hill? She asked. I want to see if it's the way I drew it. So she followed my truck out the county road and up the gravel lane under the apple trees. And when she got out of her car in my yard, she just stood there with her hand over her mouth. The late light was coming down gold through the leaves the way it does in early autumn, and the hives sat in the green shade humming their one low note. And the whole orchard was doing the thing it does that I've never been able to put into words. It's exactly right, she whispered. I got it exactly right, and I hadn't even seen it. I walked her out among the hives. I gave her a veil and showed her how to stand still, how to move slow, how the bees would land on your arm and walk around and lift off again if you just stayed calm and let them. She was calm, calmer than most people. She stood in the middle of the humming orchard with a bee, walking across the back of her hand, and tears just running down her face, not from fear. And she laughed at herself, and wiped them with her shoulder, because her hands were busy being still. My grandfather used to say, you have to tell the bees things, I said. Tell them the important things, or they leave. What do you tell them? I hadn't planned to say it. But standing there, with the light going down, and this woman I'd waited 15 years for standing in my grandfather's orchard, it came out on its own. I'm going to have to tell them you came back, I said. It's the most important thing that's happened here in a long time. She turned and looked at me, and the bee lifted off her hand, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she stepped in, careful of the hives, and put her forehead against my shoulder, and I put my arms around her, and we stood in the middle of the orchard while the bees hummed around us like they approved. That was the beginning. Nora didn't leave. She meant to, at first. She had a lease on an apartment in a city 4 hours away and a career made of deadlines and cities. But she started coming out to the hill on weekends. And then she started staying through the week and driving in for her meetings. And then one gray November afternoon, she stood in my kitchen and said she'd let the lease go, that she could draw orchards from an actual orchard, that she was tired of drawing a place from memory when the place was right here. The first weeks were slow, and I was glad of it. Neither of us was a rushing person. She'd drive out on a Friday evening, and we'd cook something simple and sit on the porch steps not talking much, watching the light go off the orchard. And it was the most comfortable I'd been with another human being in my adult life. I'd forgotten a person could be easy to be near. I'd started to think the quiet in me meant I wasn't built for company. Turned out I'd just never met the right quiet to sit next to. I taught her the bees a little at a time. How to read a frame, brood in the center, and honey at the edges, like a map of a small ordered world. How to tell a content hive from an anxious one by the sound. She learned it faster than anyone I'd tried to teach, and she drew what she learned, frame after frame, until she understood a hive better on paper than most people who'd kept them for years. One evening she looked up from a drawing and asked me, dead serious, whether I thought the bees remembered my grandfather. I told her I didn't know. She said she thought a place could remember a person even if the bees couldn't, and that this hill remembered all of them, and maybe that was what I'd been keeping alive up here without knowing I was doing it. I didn't have anything to say to that. I just reached over and held her hand across the porch step, and we watched it get dark. I built her a table by the window that looked out over the hives, and she worked there in the mornings while I worked the boxes, and at noon we'd have lunch on the porch, and she'd show me what she'd drawn. Her children's books started having a honey-colored light in them that her editor said was new and warmer, and asked what had changed. Nora would just smile and not answer. She hung the old jar on the windowsill over her table, the empty one, the one she'd carried for 15 years. Right next to it she put a full one, so the light came through both, gold and slow, morning after morning. I learned her the way you learn a hive, patiently over seasons. I learned that she hummed without knowing it when she drew, that she couldn't sleep if the window was closed, that she was still, underneath the calm, a person who had been left too many times and needed to know I wasn't going to be one more. So I told her, in the plain, slow way I have every day in 100 small ways, that I wasn't going anywhere. I'd stayed on this hill through everything. I wasn't a leaving man. She could put that on the windowsill, too. We married the next autumn, in the orchard, under the apple trees, with the hives humming a few yards off and the honey light coming down. It was small. Her mother came, fragile and trying. A few of my market friends, the women from town who'd brought me casseroles for years, came and cried and told me they'd always known, which wasn't true, but I let them have it. Before the ceremony, I did the thing you're supposed to do. I walked out alone to the hives in my good shirt, and I put my hand on the nearest box, and I told the bees I was getting married. I told them her name, Nora Bennett, soon to be Nora Hartley. I told them she'd come back after 15 years, exactly like she said she would, and that I intended to keep her, and that I'd be grateful if they'd stay for it. I felt like a fool, the way I always do. And then I felt something else, standing there in the orchard, my grandfather built, and my great-grandfather before him, telling the bees the most important thing that had ever happened to me. I felt like the last person in a long line of people who had loved this hill enough to talk to it. I felt, for the first time in my life, completely unalone. Nora found me out there. She came across the grass in her simple dress with flowers in her loose dark hair, and she stopped a few feet off, because she knew what I was doing and she didn't want to interrupt it. "Did you tell them?" she asked quietly. "I told them." "What did they say?" I looked at the hive, humming its one low note in the gold light, going about its work the way it had through every death and every winter and every year I'd spent waiting for a promise I didn't dare believe in. "They said stay," I told her. She smiled, that slow, surprised smile, and she came and took my hand. Sometimes, on a warm morning, I still think about that 14-year-old girl on the red bicycle, skinning her leg on our gravel road, refusing to cry, holding up a jar of honey like a toast, and promising a boy she'd never met before that afternoon that she'd come back. I gave her a jar of honey because I had nothing else to give, and because her whole family was coming apart and mine already had, and because for one afternoon it felt good to be the one doing the giving instead of the one being pitied. I didn't think it meant anything. I thought I was just a sad kid being briefly kind to a sad kid. But that's the thing about the small, good, clean things you do when you think no one is keeping score. They don't disappear, they go somewhere. They sit on a windowsill in a stranger's life for 15 years, empty and waiting, catching the light. And then one Saturday morning, when you've half given up on ever not being alone, they come back down the road to find you, and they hold up your own kindness like a toast, and they say the thing you didn't know you'd been waiting your whole life to hear. I promised I'd come back, and she did.